Cage Fighting Connoisseurs. This is KidNativeBloodyElbow.com, joined once again by the wayward Dallas Winston, who's checking his bookshelf for forbidden goods or
incriminating evidence.
Incriminating evidence. We've swept the area for incriminating evidence. I'm sorry to disappoint our viewers, Dallas. It's a big letdown. How are you doing today, Dallas?
I'm doing all right. It's a lovely, not really, super dreary day. Every once in a while, Michigan goes through these spells where it's dark and dreary all day long, nonstop. So that's always a mood brightener.
Oh, that'll give you that seasonal affective depression disorder or whatever they call it in Portland. Today we're going to be talking about future evolutions in MMA. This is a sequel to the one we did about a month ago where we talked about striking and new trends in striking techniques we like seeing and hope to see more of. And today we're going to talk about grappling. We're going to cover things like, first off, we're just going to use some basic moves that are underutilized that we've seen fighters have success with and talk them up. Hopefully some fighters will listen will start using them more. But we're also going to talk about some things like avant-garde jiu-jitsu, things like the 50-50 guard, the deep half guard, X guard, the Eddie Bravo system, the rubber guard, and the twister. We're going to talk about leg locks coming out of the 50-50 guard discussion. We're going to talk about neck cranks and catch wrestling. We're going to talk about what Dallas calls gimme subs, which for wrestlers with front headlock control, these are things like the Darce choke, the Bravo choke, things like front side, top side chokes. We're going to talk about the luta livre, the still surviving luta livre tradition of both the English and the Brazilian chapters of that. We're going to talk a little bit about the resurgence of combat sambo and a little bit about judo with Rick Hahn fighting for a Bellator title and Ronda Rousey as the first UFC female champion. Those are Olympic judokas. But let's start out first. I want to start with a rant. One of my pet peeves. We saw it last weekend with Shane Del Rosario against Pat Barry at the Ultimate Fighter 16 finale. Shane Del Rosario has a massive grappling advantage on Pat Barry, gets him down in the first round, and works for submissions, does no striking, does no damage. The round's over. He has nothing to show for his labors except for a 10-9 round on the judges' scorecards. Pat Barry comes out in the second and murks him in the first few seconds of the round. And I have to think, my God, if Del Rosario had been landing some ground and pound, Barry would not have been in the shape to come out and blitz him in the second like he did. Not that Perry launched like a blitz attack, but he just used fundamentally sound striking to cream Del Rosario. Whereas I think if he'd been busting him up on the ground, that would have been a different Pat Barry. Your thoughts on that, Dallas?
Well, like with everything that we do, it's kind of easy, for us to sit back and say, shit, hey, if you would have punched him in the face, really hard, dumbass. So I know maybe a professional journalist wouldn't feel the need to say that all the time, but I'm probably not a professional journalist, so I always want to add that little disclaimer. But yeah, when you brought this up before, my first comment was that it seemed some fighters once they get in top control, they completely flip the switch and go into grappling only mode. And I suppose that's natural because MMA is made up of a bunch of different chunks, and your natural inclination would be, okay, now I'm doing the MMA grappling thing. But it did seem that that would have been advantageous. A mixture of both. I think you can still be real submission heavy on your attack, but just like everything else, if you use an auxiliary source of offense like striking in that case, that can totally open up opportunities for passing, and even sometimes, most of the times actually, open up more opportunities for submissions, because when you're hunting for submissions, your opponent is defending submissions at an equal clip. So yeah, I definitely think some striking would have been a big help to him there.
To me, it's just the old jiu-jitsu MMA or Vale Tudo cliche that if you punch him in a black belt in the face and he becomes a blue belt. I think that just the impact of strikes changes people's games and mental focus, and also wears them down. Nothing's as fatiguing as getting held down and punched in the face. Nothing I know of anyway. So that was just the point I wanted to raise before we started this. And you had a ground technique that we've seen a little bit of that you'd like to see more of. What's that technique?
Yeah, we might as well, I guess, kind of segue into strikes for grappling, because I think we were mostly geared towards styles and submissions and that kind of thing. But of course, strikes are a big part of that. And the one in question that you mentioned was the two examples I can think of, just for whatever reason, Clay Guida against Diego Sanchez. And when Sanchez got taken down and he was on his back, he fired off some spiking elbows. So you can throw a spiking elbow in any position as long as it's not the illegal one, which is directly perpendicular to the floor. So you can even throw this one and add an angle this way, or you can throw that one what would normally be illegally, but add an arc at the end. Either way, all that's legal. And it seems like in that situation, it wasn't just, hey, he held his own off his back. I mean, he beat the piss out of Clay from the top. I want to say Clay ended up backing off and ejecting from the top position because of that, ruthless barrage.
Busted him up from his back.
Yeah, you got to be a little careful because you do get a little bit close to the mohawk, the back side of the mohawk for top of the head. A lot of times you'll hear referees, which I don't like that they do that, they warn immediately, even if something is even close when whatever. But that's brutally effective, because you can close your guard and get really strong hip control and actually use that as leverage and almost center the guy right in your sweet spot with your hips and just crank those elbows down. And the best position for that is when the top guy is posturing down. And I forget what fight it was. I think maybe it was a Bellator fight recently, but it was I'm not going to be able to remember it. The cat that Anthony Leon, featherweight,
yes.
And he won. Great fight. In the last 2 minutes, the whole fight was a back and forth scramble, constantly seesaw battle. But then the last 2 minutes, very wisely, instead of being active, it was pretty clear to me he decided, I want to finish the round, these last 2 minutes on top. And he took a body lock and locked it underneath the guy. And to me, that's a clear sign that you're not doing anything. You're not going for submissions. You're not going to strike. You are going to hold top control. And I didn't think that was enough to get him the round, really, because it's just that. You're holding the guy for top control, and it's over. It's a smart ploy because the judges see that as, talk about my pet peeve. The guy on top is winning just pisses me off to no end. But in that situation, when the guy's basing down, and either when you control his posture or he's got his forehead or his chin sandwiched down onto your chest, and he's that close, that's a prime example where that strike could be brutally effective. If there's anything that's going to persuade you that your head's not in a good position, it's a huge bombardment of elbows like that. So I think and doesn't that seem like that's fairly underused?
It's really a rarely seen technique, and it's a very common position. We see people trapped in the guard all the time on their backs with the top of their opponent's head just sitting there begging to be elbowed. So yeah, I think it's a viable one. One point I want to mention is I think you talked about the habit of a lot of fighters to segue into grappling mode, and I think that's the key thing, like the thing that separates an elite mixed martial artist from your average fighter is the ability to transition from one phase of combat to the next. And somebody like Fedor Emelianenko or BJ Penn at his best, those are two guys that I just always thought of as being brilliant phase shifters. The same with Rashad Evans. These are guys
Faber
that
too.
Oh, you're right, Faber's excellent. Yeah, where they segue from punching or kicking to grappling and vice versa, and they're thinking of ways to set up the grappling with the striking, or set up the takedown with the striking, set up the grappling with the takedown, and that's what, to me, one of the factors that separates an elite martial artist from just your average fighter. And it's clearly very difficult to do, and MMA is very complicated because it's like a decathlon where you have to learn multiple different sports and disciplines, and to be able to mix them on the fly like that is clearly a very difficult thing to do. But now let's talk about styles a little bit more, and I want to jump our outline a little bit and talk about combat sambo. I think that sambo, perhaps Fedor was a sambo guy. Sambo might be the best base for phase shifting because as a martial art, it involves grappling and striking integrated together in a seamless whole. It's pretty much mixed martial arts. It just doesn't allow a lot of chokes or any chokes, and doesn't allow sustained grappling, so it encourages people to go for submissions very quickly, which, when the combat sambo guys first encountered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the Jiu-Jitsu fighters' emphasis on controlling position and never going for risky, and patience really gave the Jiu-Jitsu guys an advantage over the sambo guys who are used to just diving for leg locks and and going for broke quickly, and knew nothing about chokes, or very little about chokes, because it's forbidden in the combat sambo rules. But we're seeing some of these Russian fighters make a bit of a comeback. We had Rustam Khabilov, or Hobby Lobby, as Mike Goldberg called him, make a big splash on the Ultimate Fighter finale this weekend. Of course, he was doing it with some good old-fashioned Dagestani wrestling more than any combat sambo technique. He landed was it a triple? 3 suplexes or 2 suplexes? 3 suplexes.
3 belly-to-back suplexes, and the last 2 he had his arm trapped, so head crunchers.
Yeah.
It was like Fedor versus Randleman, except without Fedor's recovery.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I don't know, do you remember seeing a belly-to-back, I know we've seen slam KOs, but in the UFC, do you remember seeing an over-the-head belly-to-back knockout?
No, I do not. The most dramatic suplexes I can think of in the UFC go way back to Dan Severn versus Anthony Macias at UFC 4. He didn't get a knockout with those.
And those weren't even close. I mean, Macias scrambled. As soon as he hit the ground, he was off.
Yeah.
I think that was the first suplex slam knockout in the UFC, right? I mean,
it's definitely one of the first I can think of ever. I mean, I remember Kazuki Miyagi. Is that his name? What's the Olympic wrestler, Japanese guy that was big in Dream and K1 for a long time? Miyata.
I believe it's Miyata.
Yeah, he did some pretty kicking rainbow suplexes in some Dream events 2 years ago or so, but didn't get the knockout.
Kabelov's, I believe he's got another knockout previously on that, and I know, who was it? Maybe Disco and Herpes on the Bloody Elbow Community guy. Nick Denis had a real nice right before he got in the UFC. Just like Kabelov, over the head suplex knockout. So rare. I mean, beautiful. Beautiful violence. What a debut.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I would love to see more of. I mean, it's a risky move, as Kabelov said. It's my business to throw him. It's his business how he lands. And so, spiking somebody directly, vertically on their head, top of their head, is illegal because it's just manifestly, impossibly dangerous. You'd see a lot of instant paralysis if you allowed fighters to do that. But slamming the way Kabelov did, where they land on the back of the head and their shoulders, if you know how to roll with the throw like that, you can come out of it just fine, as Fedor Emelianenko famously showed against Kevin Randleman in Pride, where he took a slam that was very close to being a vertical spike right on the top of the head, rolled immediately, and got a Kimura on Randleman. So it's not necessarily a killing move, but it's a very effective one. I really enjoyed seeing Kabelov employ it, and I hope to see more of it in the future.
Not to interrupt you, but the deal on that is, even if Kabelov would have straightened him out, that's all legal. The verbiage in the unified rules on that is, it would be like the big-time wrestling pile driver. It specifically states you have to lift your opponent up and straighten his legs and drop him straight down. So all that shit is legal. You have to. There was only one example. I want to say, I think he got a point taken away. Who was it? It was Marquardt and...
Marquardt. It was against Thiago...
Talaslitis?
Talaslitis.
Is that who it was?
Yeah,
that was the only one, and
that
one was about as close as you can get, because when I first heard that rule, I thought, well, hell, no one's going to, lock a guy's head between his knees and, do the traditional... pro wrestling thing. But Marquardt's was pretty close, because that was a position where he had a waist lock, but the guy's head was down, kind of in his crotch area. And the other one that was a lot like that was Alan Belcher versus Patrick Cote. And I know Cote was real pissed off and frustrated at that, but that was a perfect example where his lower body and his legs were not even close to being straightened up. So all that's, perfectly legal. And the other one, while I'm going on the rule thing, who was that? Fabricio Camoes had maybe Kurt Pellegrino's back.
Yep.
And we saw it again with Belcher and Okami.
Spiked face first.
Okami had Belcher's back and standing back ride, and Belcher did a front flip, and all that's perfectly legal, because the guy holding on has the ability to let go. If he goes along for the ride and gets spiked, that's on him.
Yeah, I think Gilbert Melendez and Clay Guida, I can't remember, I think it was Melendez doing that to Guida when Guida was on his back way back when at an early Strikeforce title fight, long before Strikeforce was a Zuffa property and before Guida was a UFC fighter. This brings me to the new Bellator heavyweight champion, Alexander Volkov, another Sambo guy. What do you think of Volkov? You think that is he a B-League fighter, or is he somebody that you think is going to make a major impact in the sport?
That's like the ongoing debate and mystery is comparing. It used to be comparing Pride fighters to UFC fighters, and then Strikeforce fighters to UFC fighters. So to me, that's just I guess I'm a veteran enough of talking about that in like 15 years that who knows? I don't know. He appears to have the potential to be. Yeah, absolutely. I think surprisingly that a shitload of Bellator fighters would hold their own in the UFC.
Oh,
a lot of people shit their pants when you say something like that, and I think that's kind of ridiculous because the first thing they do is they say, well, how would they do against a wrestler like, and they'll list off the 3 best wrestlers in the world at that weight class. How would that guy do against GSP, Fitch, and, Rory McDonald? It's like, well, fuck, no one can do that. If they did, they would be, in that same list.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, he's legit. Bellator's bringing in some, it's weird. Like last year and the year before, it was an influx of really hot Brazilian talent. And now all of a sudden it's like, they open the floodgates for Russia. And there's a lot of really good, Sarnovsky and Volkov. There's a lot of really good talent coming out of there. Well-rounded. A lot of them surprised they are real long and lanky, but still real quick. I guess to answer your question, I don't know if he's top level worldwide or UFC caliber. He definitely has the potential to, and I'll enjoy watching him to find out.
For sure. I think it's important to know that he's anything but a pure Sambo fighter, even though he trains under Fedor Emelianenko at the Red Devil Sport Club. And I don't know what his combat Sambo competitive background is, if any. I do know, he's got a black belt in Kyokushin Karate, and he's got a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So the age of the one disciplined fighter is long past. And so when we talk about these things in generalizations, just assume we're making the caveat that's saying, it's all about individual fighters and the individual blend of creativity, learning, and inspiration that they bring to the cage. I mean, you have multiple fighters in the same camp, even if they've been training together for a decade or more, will express their techniques in completely different ways inside the cage. So we're not trying to impose some sort of simplistic worldview on this, or that this is a thing about styles. It's just a way to talk about it in a way that makes sense, and we can try to see some big picture developments. And
a good example of that is, sorry, I'm going to cut you off again, but a good example of that is, when I'm doing all the dissections or pre-fight, predictions and previews or whatever, it used to be when you wanted to, measure a guy's ground game, it was, well, what's his belt color? And that has, decreasingly become nothing. It means almost nothing. We've seen black belts get smoked. We've seen 2 black belts fight each other and one be on a completely different level. A good example is the 2 guys that came to mind are Dustin Poirier and Stefan Struve. I think Poirier is only listed as a purple belt. That cat's at the black belt level in MMA. He's a pimp sub-grappler. Same with Struve. That color of your belt just does not mean anything anymore, which is good. It shows kind of what you were just saying. We love to talk about little individual pieces of the overall puzzle, but as far as the overall puzzle is concerned, it's MMA. It's its own sport with its own variables. So it's nice to see that evolution, and I think we're always going to see more. And I think I like what we're talking about today because it fits into my big bitch about the guy on top is always winning, and I understand a little bit of that mentality. I totally disagree with it. I think the ground should be neutral, but one thing that will help strengthen my thoughts on that is if people learn more weapons and they're more effective from guard. The guard should not be a position where you're desperately, right now to win off your back in MMA, you need to finish or you need to sweep or escape, which is kind of crazy because that means in prolonged exchanges, 9 times out of 10, the scores reflect that you can't or you're not going to win that, which is ridiculous. I mean, guy on top can be just as effective as the guy on the bottom.
It's very frustrating, and it just goes back to the paucity of qualified referees and judges in mixed martial arts. So few of these guys seem to have any understanding of the rules or the basic tenets of grappling whatsoever. the infamous quote, of course, is Cecil Peoples, "You can't win a fight with a leg kick" quote, but it's very clear from their judging patterns that many judges feel like the guy on bottom is losing no matter what's actually happening inside the cage, and that's extremely frustrating. I want to segue now a little bit. We talked about these combat sambo guys, and we talked about throws a little bit, and let's keep it in Bellator and on the topic of throws. And we've got a judoka, an Olympic judoka, Rick Hahn, who's going to be fighting for the Bellator lightweight championship against Mike Chandler coming up in 2013. What do you think of Hahn and what he's brought to the cage with his judo stylings? I've seen him pull some pretty impressive, very fluid Seoinage throws. That's the over-the-shoulder throw, where you get somebody's arm, you turn around, turn your back to him, and throw him over the top. He's been able to implement that stuff lightning quick, but for the most part, he seems to be a sprawl and brawl fighter, where he likes to use his judo to keep the fight on the feet, whereas heavy hands can impact it. Whereas Ronda Rousey, the other big judoka who's making an impact right now, another Olympic, she was an Olympic medalist, winning the bronze medal, I believe, in 2008 in Beijing. And she uses her judo just to get those trip takedowns and go straight to the armbar. So two very different applications of the same, very similar sporting background. Which of these fighters do you think is more influential? Do you see more judokas coming down the pipeline, or are these kind of one-offs?
Well, that's a lot of questions all at once, Nate. Remind me about if we'll see more judo guys.
Do you think these guys? Yeah, is this are these kind of flukes where we're seeing Hahn and Rousey just because of their circumstances, and that you don't expect to see more judokas making an impact? Or do you think we're going to see a continuing influx of people with serious judo backgrounds making an impact in MMA?
Well, they're exceptions because they're Olympic level judokas. So anytime you're Olympic level in any individual building block for MMA, you're going to be almost unstoppable, if not, damn good chance you're going to, clown your opponent in that category. And then you're way ahead of the game then when you start to put together the other pieces. So both of those two, I think, are amongst the top most phenomenal athletes in the game. Rick Hahn, maybe if I had to pick one guy from Bellator that I'm completely sold on, and I would put him right in the mix with almost any of the top guys, it would be Rick Hahn. And most of that is because, really watching him closely, following him when he was coming up, just dying to see some monster slam or hip throw, I was shocked at how amazing that dude's kickboxing is for how small of a time frame he's been doing it. And he's not a guy that does a bunch of flashy stuff, but if you had to list out like 10 or 15 important qualities to identify good kickboxing in MMA, he gets strong marks all the way across the board. So to me, and that kind of goes with our theme. That's what makes him a special fighter. Is he's not a one-dimensional, judoka. He's going to come in and he can do both. Actually, he's preferred to stand up and trade with a guy like Jay Huron, who's known for good boxing and a tough scrapper. And Rousey, what can you say about Rousey? It's, to me, it could be seen as bad, but to me, it's uncanny that she can replicate the same chain of destruction every time. Get in close, clinch, hip throw, armbar. It's shocking that she can pull that off. And I know a lot of people say, well, the talent pool's more watered down in women's. Well, that could be it, but none of that fucking matters for Rousey. She's gonna fight whoever's in front of her, and she's not fighting chumps. So it's tough to gauge women's MMA, but of course it'd be nice to see her against Cyborg. Two totally different, even though Cyborg's a black belt.
The striking. Sarah McMahon, the Olympic wrestler, is coming.
There's a lot of tough. There's a lot of tough women out there that Rousey has to. She can still legitimize her record by fighting. It's not like she's cleaned everybody out. The women's talent pool. It's not as vast as the men's, but there are some really solid female fighters out there that can still pose a good risk for her, and at least give us some exciting fights, in the interim.
Yeah, I think the when we were doing research for this discussion, we pulled in the Bloody Elbow grappling team, KJ Gould, Ben Thapa, TP Grant, and Patrick Tinney, all those guys. And the one thing that came out of the discussion was that they were talking about leg locks, but they were talking about the way with grappling there's so many so many aspects that can be fine-tuned that you get these guys. Imanari is one I think of, the Japanese fighter who's just been a leg lock master for a long time, that if a fighter works on a specific set of techniques, they can learn an entire arsenal of setups. It might look like just one heel hook or one knee bar to the audience, but what the fighter is actually bringing to the table is he's got one finish technique, but he might have 50 setups for it. And so the opponent thinks, well, they're not going to get, he's not going to get me in that bullshit leg lock. I know how to get out of a leg lock. Well, yeah, sure, you know 5 ways to get out of leg locks, but do you know 50? And he's coming at you with multiple setups, and it seems very clear that Rousey has endless setups for that same move. I mean, she's going to go get the trip or the hip toss straight to the armbar and get the tap, and she's just so good and so tight with her grappling that so far it's proved to be unstoppable. I'm really looking forward to seeing her tested against, she's fought some very tough ladies, but I think Cyborg and Sarah McMahon are the ones, and no disrespect to Liz Carmouche, I think that'll be a good fight too. Frankly, I expect Rousey, I'd say there's a better than 60% chance that Rousey does the same exact game plan to Carmouche, but
she's going to be favored against everybody right now, though.
Yeah.
So Carmouche, that's not going to be. She won't be any different from that.
If Cyborg has to come down and weight. But while we're making the segue, we've been, the 50-50 guard's been kind of a fetish of mine on Bloody Elbow recently. That's a position that's been popularized in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition by Ryan Hall. But you've seen a lot of guys. Marcin Held did a lot of it in Bellator recently. Imanari is just masterful at it. Alan Belcher actually used the 50-50 guard to stymie Ruzimar Palhares and his leg lock attacks. So
Ballsy.
I think we're seeing the 50-50 guard definitely make an impact. It's clearly not a technique, and basically it's a scissor position where you've got where it's a 50-50 position. A guy's got one leg wrapped around the dude's other leg, which means that when you go into that position, you're leaving one of your legs trapped in the middle of your opponent's legs, so that you can get these leg lock battles. But what
used to be just called playing footsies in the Valley Tudo or Pancrase days. That's what we always used. It's 2 guys dueling leg locks. They're both in leg lock position, pretty much.
Yeah, it makes me think of the old Ken Shamrock Funaki days, or Ken Shamrock versus Suzuki. You'd see a lot of these just dueling leg lock battles. But the thing I think that's different about the way that, say, Marcin Held does it or Imanari is that they'll get control of their opponent's leg. They'll do a figure 4 and get complete control of the opponent's leg. And what Marcin Held did to Rick Clemente at Bellator 81 was just it was a testament to the state of the art in one-trick ponies in MMA today. I mean, I don't think Held is somebody that's even going to contend for a Bellator title or hold a Bellator title, but he's certainly a dangerous opponent and somebody you have to think twice about. That you wouldn't want to just sign on the dotted line to fight that cat without doing some serious preparation and being ready, prepared for a number of leg lock attacks. And of course, Masakazu Imanari has made an entire career out of leg locks, and he's still going strong. He's never gone to ascend to the world title level, but dude's a factor in every fight he's in. What do you think? Do you think this is just some kind of one-off stuff that we'll see at the lower levels, but not see make a big impact in the UFC, or do you think this is something we'll see more and more of as time goes on?
Well, I think it fits exactly what you said before, that it's another area that never, you've never really heard people focus on the 50-50 guard, and it's a little bit of, it's kind of the rage right now. Luke Thomas's article on MMA fighting with comments from Ryan Hall was phenomenal. I mean, I'd recommend that to anyone who either doesn't know a lot about it or wants to know more. The only thing that's a little odd to me about this is, how do you go out and say, I'm going to implement the 50-50 guard? I mean, to me, it's totally effective, and guys like Marcin Held showed that there's a whole, different world of transitions, because that's what it's more than the 50-50 guard. What he did against Clemente was he transitioned like a maniac bastard from one to the other nonstop. And interesting point that you brought up, that he footlocked or he figure four'd the leg, because he ended up figure four in the lower leg and finishing with a straight ankle lock. So
I believe it was a toe hold. He
Oh yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Yep. Yeah. But he had, he figure forward, all that's, so
figure
that
forward the foot.
You could almost
Frank Mir did to Tank Abbott way back in the day.
Right. So you could almost just right there, if you want to like isolate that little, like freeze that, isolate that, and talk about the different variables. I mean, think about how many different transitions and setups you can do just from the figure 4, position on the foot like that. So it's definitely something that I think right now requires a specialist to really perform in it. But that's how everything happens in MMA. A specialist comes out and shows wizardry in one tiny little area that has everyone saying, holy shit, I didn't know you could have that much of a, that diversity in your offense from such a fairly obscure position. But overall, I think it's just going to be another arrow in the quiver. If you find yourself in or close to that position, I think the realistic next step is that people are going to be much more well-versed and knowledgeable, rather than people saying, I'm a 50-50 guard guy, I'm going to go out and impose my 50-50 guard. It's hard enough to impose a guard game in MMA, without pulling guard or, whatever. That's another area we should talk about sometime, the art of pulling guard. So, yeah, I don't expect it to make big waves, but I do expect it to be a little isolated segment that we'll see more progression in, and we'll be talking about more often.
And I think, honestly, the Alan Belcher example is probably the most thing, like when Belcher fought Rousimar Palhares, Palhares is a very feared leg lock master, and this guy's, they call him the tree trunk, Toquinho, because he's just so stout and strong, and he's got the skills, and he's hurt many a man's knee with a serious injury, and Belcher fought him at I think the third UFC on Fox, the Nate Diaz versus Jim Miller event back in May, and totally turned the tables and had clearly been studying a little bit of this 50-50 guard stuff, because he was not afraid or intimidated at all when Palhares was going for his legs, and he immediately attacked the obvious vulnerability the 50-50 guard is. When you're fighting over legs, you're very vulnerable to being punched in the face, and that's what Belcher did, and that really takes your mind off of your grappling attack when you're eating punches from somebody like Alan Belcher. So I expect it's going to continue to be, excuse me, an arms race.
Oh my gosh! Wow. Bless you. I think you blew my.
An arms race where fighters, you see somebody offensively develop, a relatively obscure line of attack like leg locks, being a leg lock specialist. You're going to see guys like Alan Belcher that are going to bring in some leg lock specialists and learn how to counter them, and then it's back to square one. So it's not something I see that's going to revolutionize the game, but it's something I think that's going to be a factor, and I think you're going to continue to see guys like Held or Imanari that make this, or Palhares, that make this their specialty and do quite well. I don't think you'll see him get to championship level, but I think you'll see him at the contender level at the UFC and Bellator. But
before you go on, what's kind of interesting? This just came to mind because of what I was talking about before, how it would be hard to go out and impose that position. It's a little bit of contrasting styles, but if you think about it, the best way to implement that would be a wrestler. And I'm thinking like Arlovsky versus Sylvia. So when you take a guy down and he's on his back in the butt scoop position, and you stand up right there, you have to just hook a leg and drop back, and that's the 50-50 guard. So random, but that just popped into mind. And wrestlers, behind maybe boxers, would probably be the least inclined to go out and implement that position. But I don't know, that all of a sudden is a very viable way to kickstart the 50-50 guard position.
Absolutely, and you're referring, of course, to the first Andrei Arlovsky-Tim Sylvia fight, where Arlovsky stunned him with a punch and then immediately dropped down, took the leg, got the heel hook, and tapped him out.
It was an Achilles lock, I think.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. It was which is a straight up pain submission, which is you rarely see somebody get a tap with that at that level. And talking about wrestlers, and that brings me to another one of my hobby horses, which is catch wrestling. And also top chokes, which are jiu-jitsu techniques like the Darce choke and the Bravo choke. They're basically arm triangle chokes, but they're done from the top, while both fighters are facing down. It's not like a north-south choke where one fighter's facing up and the other fighter's on top but facing down. But wrestlers have submission holds were eliminated from competitive wrestling in the U.S. in the early part of the 20th century, but there's a long tradition of wrestlers using submission holds in what's called the catch wrestling tradition, which was carny wrestling. These traveling wrestlers would go to carnivals, which is ironically where jiu-jitsu first came into the ring. Maeda, the man who taught the Gracies, was a judoka who got on the catch wrestling circuit and toured North America, Europe, and then finally South America, showing off how his judo and jiu-jitsu techniques could stand up against catch wrestling under catch wrestling rules. Anyway, so you've got this long tradition of connection with catch wrestling and MMA. Ken Shamrock, Frank Shamrock, the Funaki, Minari,
Josh Barnett.
guys, Josh Barnett, all came out of catch wrestling traditions. Eric Paulson's another one with a catch wrestling background. And you're seeing, I think, Glenn Mellinson at Extreme Couture is a catch wrestling guy, and he's teaching a lot of top fighters there. So I think you're going to see more wrestlers using neck cranks and front chokes. Like, do you remember who it was Matt Hughes choked out with the front choke a while back? It was a beautiful, classic, basically illegal wrestling move that I don't think he learned. I think he learned in a wrestling gym just as a nasty way to cheat in practice and hurt guys. Pulling up.
The guys that come to mind right off the bat are Paulo Thiago. And not necessarily that he excels with them, but everyone, got off on the way he hammered Mike Swick. And then when he pounced, right off the bat, he went for a darce and locked it up. And another good guy who I think has evolved from a one-dimensional pure wrestler and has added some of that is Jacob Volkmann. Classic example. And the reason I think it's a really smart, sensible is I always call these gimme subs if a guy like, Uriah Faber, Team Alpha Male, they're wrestling so often, attacking the hips that you'll ultimately end up either in the clinch or in the front headlock position. And I mean, that's guillotine 101 right there.
Yep.
The problem with that is to really, we see a lot of guys drop back for a guillotine, and that's a huge pivot point because it's a commitment. You better get it, because if not, you just gave up position and now you're going to let your guy be on his back. The reason I like, Darce/Bravo chokes and anacondas is you don't have to get on your back. It's a power position. You can actually, once you have that locked up, it's going to, incrementally increase the pressure, the force that you can apply on the guy, and you don't have to sacrifice your position for it. And a beautiful example, I'm glad I thought of this, Chris Weidman against Mark Munoz.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about, to me, that was like a three-dimensional fighter showcase because we knew he could wrestle. I wasn't so sold on his striking because, Jesse Bongfeld, and he looked really poor against Damian Maia. I thought classic, nobody won that fight. That should have been a draw. But against Munoz, obviously he showed he could strike. And then the way he transitioned, talk about another phase shifter too. From that front headlock position, he would go from striking to submissions and all these power topside. He wasn't grabbing a guillotine and looking to drop back. It was frenetic, nonstop pressure, both with striking and submission attempts, and everything chained together seamlessly. It was beautiful. I think that's going to be, I don't want to say the next evolution. If I'm a wrestler and I'm coming up and trying to broaden my game, that's going to be the first thing I'm gonna start adding on.
Absolutely. And the Matt Hughes fight I was trying to think of was his match against Ricardo Almeida at UFC 117 2 years ago, where he used the Dave Schultz front headlock. Dave Schultz was a famous Olympic wrestler, and it's not a move that's legal in wrestling competition, but it's very common in wrestling gyms because it's like you say, it's a gimme submission. And I think that we've got so many wrestlers in MMA that are looking for ways to distinguish themselves, and I think learning these old school dirty wrestling submission holds, adding some catch wrestling to your repertoire, learning the jiu-jitsu attacks, the Darce choke, the Bravo choke, and incorporating these into your game will be an excellent way to distinguish yourself, and also an excellent way to win fights definitively. Like, you don't want to. I mean, John Fitch has had a very successful career going for decisions, but it's a lot easier if you can use that dominant position to get a submission early in the fight. It's a more crowd-pleasing style, and it's an easier style on your body. So I hope to see a lot more wrestlers incorporate that into their game. And one I want to segue from there, and one thing we've been seeing recently, I think Shinya Aoki was the first one I can remember really doing a lot of this, but did it to Lyle Beerbaum at Strikeforce a couple years ago in the Diaz versus Daly event, and that's where they turned failed rear naked chokes into very successful neck cranks or face cranks. So we saw Damian Maia do one not long ago. Do you remember who he cranked out? And Rick Story. Damian Maia had Rick Story bleeding from the nose like a faucet with just a vicious neck crank. And so I think you're going to see, we're already seeing a lot of guys expanding their arsenal and showing that even, fighters have gotten very good at tucking their chin and doing the hand battle to prevent the rear naked choke, but that creates a lot of opportunities for face cranks because you don't have to have your arm under the chin, and it's a brutal and scary, dangerous technique that I love and hope to see more of. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a keeper, or do you think it's in the novelty category?
It's I don't know. It's interesting. When we all listed a bunch of topics to cover, and you brought that up, it was it was kind of one of those. I wouldn't have thought of that, and it's intriguing. If you think about it, the first one I always think of is Tito Ortiz when Yuki Kondo came over back in the dark ages, and that was legit. Kondo had lost a couple, but he was one of the premier. Over there it would have been middleweight, but whatever 205 area. Really well-rounded, and Tito, I believe, finished him with a neck crank, and it's kind of interesting to think about because it's as basic as it gets. We talk about the complexities of submissions and everything else, and there's 50, 60 steps sometimes, both in the setup and the finish. But that's caveman. Neck bend, ouch, that kind of. So it's intriguing because if you think about how big and strong some of the guys are. If they just twist the shit out of your neck, that's got to hurt. And that could be, that's probably one of the most intriguing because it's so simple. So I don't know. That's one where I would really love the input to get another fighter on here, a coach, someone with, vast MMA knowledge and experience to get their take on that because it's a compelling suggestion that I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, I've been fascinated with it for a while, and it's something we're seeing more of. And I think if you watch, say, Billy Robinson, who's a legendary catch wrestler and coach, he's one of the guys that taught the Funakis and Suzukis of the world, and Ken Shamrock, and by descent Frank Shamrock and Josh Barnett as well. I think if you watch some of his videos on neck cranks, you'll see there's more to it than just caveman. That there's like any other submission, there's quite a few refinements. With the right application of position and leverage, you can take a hold and just apply not even any more strength than an unsuccessful crank and make it just an absolutely lethal guaranteed finish just by making certain fine tunings in the way you position your arms and your opponent's neck. And I just hope that wrestlers are paying attention and learning these techniques. There's one technique I want to throw out there that I haven't seen for a couple of years, but I saw a couple guys doing, which is what the wrestlers call a crucifix, but it's not the crucifix we think of in MMA, which is the famous Gary Goodridge position where you've got an opponent and you control one arm with two legs and the other arm with two arms, and you've got him pinned to the ground. I'm talking about the crucifix where you put a guy in basically a stockade.
Standing crucifix.
Yeah, put pressure down. They get the arms laced through the shoulders and have their opponent's head under their armpits. And so I remember Kiyoshi Hironaka, who's a UFC veteran, pulled one of these at Zest many years ago, I think back in 2009, and got a tap. And then the
Katsunari Kukuno almost put out Eddie Alvarez with that hold, and that was the dream
12.
That they took place in the cage, I believe.
Yep.
And Eddie came on the underground and was answering questions, and I bounced one out about that because it was so unique. And he said, "Holy shit, I was shocked. I thought it was I'm a former wrestler and been in that position before. I didn't think anything was cooking." But he said, "I got nervous. It started to, and I almost started to go out until I had to do whatever I could to escape." So that's a legit hold.
Yeah, and it's another one, and it makes me think of Brock Lesnar's stockade against Frank Mir, where he basically got Mir in a full Nelson, but just with one arm. He laced his one arm through Mir's shoulders and had Mir trapped like this with the other hand free to punch him. And I think that's a fairly unique move because of Lesnar's ginormous arms and incredible power. He was able to do that. But I think it's something that you'll see more of. I think I'd love to see John Jones spend some time working on holds like this. He might be more of a leverage top trip guy than really upper body strength controller.
But his leverage on the ground, his arms can snake around. He's an excellent candidate for dark strokes and that kind of thing, where it's not like he reaches through. His arms turn into like pythons, go gadget style. So that would be intriguing for a fighter like him. That would, even though he's a leverage guy, that would complement his leverage very well on the ground.
And so the one I want to segue from there into luta livre, which we've seen have kind of a renaissance. And luta livre is the old Brazilian rival of jiu-jitsu. It's a variant of catch wrestling. Fighters opposing the Gracies and other jiu-jitsu fighters going back to the 1930s and 40s and 20s even developed that style. And a man named Tatu was one of in the 40s beat Roger Gracie way back in 1940 in a very publicized match in Brazil. And so that tradition, and a lot of times you see luta livre defined as jiu-jitsu without the gi, and a lot will be talked about how jiu-jitsu fighters were wealthy and could afford the gi and the training, and luta livre guys tended to be from the streets. I think that's something that you would see more in the 80s and 90s when there was the really serious luta livre versus jiu-jitsu rivalry, when you had luta livre guys like Hugo Duarte, Eugenio Taddeo.
That's that's favela talk,
Yeah.
I mean, now the way, and if you think about it, saying no gi BJJ, well, what the hell, that doesn't tell you anything. That's like saying no gi judo. Well, what is it? The gi is so integral to all that. You can't just remove it and say and make that a sensible description. So but that's the easiest way to kind of describe it, because I know that it's not a direct correlate. You can't say it's Brazilian catch wrestling. It's the easiest and most simple way is to say it's a Brazilian style of grappling that they did without the gi. What's so interesting about that is, even though their numbers were smaller, the way everyone decided with the Desafio events, that was supposedly, let's figure out what's better, BJJ or luta livre. All that was Vale Tudo, and it had no gi. So really the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys were not grappling Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because they weren't wearing a gi. So I don't know, that's all kind of crazy. But the biggest, by far, outpour of all the luta livre fighters stems back to Marcio Cremado. Goes by the name Barbosa. He was an old Shuto fighter. I think he only had 5 or 6 fights. He beat Kaualuno, lost to a couple big guys, Ryan Bowe, one of the guy I train under. But he is now churning out. His top student is Marcelo Brigadeiro, and Brigadeiro is I thought he was the head grappling coach, but he's the luta livre coach over at Team Keoban. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I've read it a million times, never had to say it out loud. And of course, under Brigadeiro is Paul Sass, legendary leg lock guy, Terry Adam, and over in Brazil, the Hanau Vacau fight team. The guy used to be kind of the single rep was Luciano Azevedo, who was one of my lurking favorite fighters. He's the guy who fought Maha Sakurai in Pride, went up a weight class, fought him on short notice, and lost on a stoppage, and that was the only time he got knocked out. I thought he was going to make some waves, but he came over and fought Antonio McKeon MFC and got brutalized. Turns out afterwards he had never, all the rules over there, they didn't have elbows on the ground. They had punches, and that's when we started talking about the twisting elbow from wrist control elbow kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But they have a host of fighters over in Bellator. Nogueira, who goes as Beitao, or a lot of people call him Little Nog, or not even little, they're Mini Nog maybe.
Yeah.
Junior Jenner da Silva is his name, but Junior PQD, which is some kind of short paraphrase in Brazilian for he's an old paratrooper. Mikel Falcao is all those guys train under Camaro. They're out of RFT, and they're all flying the luta livre flag. And it's good to see that come back. And I'll go back once again. It's not that luta livre is going to be the one style to change anything, but it's an interesting base. Before it was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is how you grapple on the ground, and that's it. And I respect a lot, like even what Eddie Bravo has done, even though a lot of people take issue with it. Fighters need to have a system on the ground that's no-gi, that's perfectly tailored and suitable for MMA. And so you can call that no-gi, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, luta libre, catch wrestling, any of that stuff. It really doesn't matter what the roots are. It's got to be fully functional for, no holds barred, MMA kind of thing. And it's good to see other practitioners, other than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, things like catch, luta libre, a lot of that stuff come in and infiltrate and stake their claim as a viable, source for that.
Absolutely. I wanted to correct. It was Tattoo was Euclides Tête-Á-Tête, and he beat George Gracie in 1940 by submission and established luta libre from then on as a mainstay of Brazilian vale tudo styles. And yeah, I just think it's awesome. I mean, there's a lot more to luta libre than just jiu-jitsu without a gi. I mean, you've got guys like Euclides Pereira who had a judo background and beat Carlson Gracie back in 1968, and Roberto Leitão was another one that put a lot of thought into developing systems. It's not just catch wrestling, or it's not just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a style with a lot of legacy and a lot of history that a lot of people have done a lot of road testing on, and it's a very proven style. And even though the wave of 90s luta libre fighters, Hugo Duarte, Joel de Oliveira, Eugenio Taddeo, they never won the big fights. But I'm trying to think. Well, Renato Babalu Sobral, he's a jiu-jitsu black belt, but he came out of a luta libre background, and he's probably the most successful of that wave of luta libre fighters. And
there was a whole list of fighters. I know you and I have only done. It's one of the ways I ended up writing for Bloody Elbow, because I would try to really cover an obscure topic, one of them being, luta libre, and I did a bunch of research and found that you had done a bunch of articles on that as well. In one of the articles I did, someone did, and it was just some guy on a message board, but he did some phenomenal research and put together a whole list of different fighters that started out in luta libre and moved over to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Babalu, I believe, is the biggest name on there. But there were a lot of the list. I was shocked. It's a long list, 15 or 20 fighters with some names that you would recognize on there.
Yeah, what happened was that for decades, luta libre and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu were in a Cold War footing. They didn't treat it as a sport with handshakes after the match. They were fighting at a very serious level. I mean, you've got things like Hugo Duarte's famous brawl with Rickson Gracie on the beach that started with Duarte throwing sand in his face, essentially. And you had the infamous 1997 event in Rio that ended vale tudo as a commercial proposition in Brazil for a decade, after Eugenio Taddeo and Renzo Gracie were fighting, and a riot erupted in the arena when the lights went out and the luta libre fans charged the cage. And so
good times, man.
Yeah,
good
so
times.
They eventually realized, hey, it's to everybody's advantage if we treat this like a sport and cut out the feuding. And they shook hands and became friendly, and sort of the short-term impact of that was almost all the luta libre guys became jiu-jitsu fighters. They started training together and got so friendly that they, changed sides, essentially. I mean, it stopped being a hot conflict. So it has been good to see Terry Edom and Paul Sass and these other students of Brigadeiro that are bringing luta libre back and flying the flag, because I think it's one of vale tudo's great traditions. It's one that American fans don't really know that much about, but it's got a legacy really just as old as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, the history of vale tudo, both in Japan and in Brazil, was the collision of catch wrestling and judo jiu-jitsu, and the same thing happened in Brazil, where you had guys coming from the jiu-jitsu side, with the Gracies being the most notable exponents, and other guys coming through the catch wrestling luta libre side. So anyway, it's something we're all very hyped for. And I do want to, before we close this out, I want to talk about Eddie Bravo a little bit, because the grappling snobs, and I love my grappling team, but they are grappling snobs, and they look down on Eddie Bravo, and they think that the rubber guard is doing nothing, but neutralizing both you and your opponent, and by holding him so close, and having one leg, pinned, leaves the other side wide open. I think Mark Bocek, who was it that Bocek just destroyed, that was trying to use rubber guard techniques on him. It was that tall kid that retired from the UFC. What was that kid's name? Let's see. Dustin Hazlett. Do you remember that fight back in 2010?
Oh, yeah, I was shocked that he tapped him.
Yeah,
that was shocking.
Yeah, Dustin Hazlett was, a pretty promising UFC fighter who did a lot of rubber guard and Eddie Bravo influenced techniques. Mark Bocek's a very highly credentialed jiu-jitsu competitor. And against Hazlett, he really did a textbook deconstruction of the weaknesses of the rubber guard game and essentially just used that open side to come around and get side mount and top control. I haven't watched that fight in a couple years, but if you're curious as to why so many of the grappling snobs are down on the rubber guard, watch that deconstruction that Bocek did on Hazlett, and you'll see some of the vulnerabilities. At the same time, Bravo's ideas have been incredibly influential in the MMA world. I mean, you've seen so many guys using the rubber guard, BJ Penn, George Soteropoulos, on, and often with quite a bit of success. I mean, you've got Nick Diaz's famous Gogo Plata submission over Takanori Gomi. Anytime you see a Gogo Plata, Bravo didn't invent the move, but he definitely was very active in popularizing it, and Shinya Aoki, among others, studied under him pretty intensively. So I wouldn't write off Eddie Bravo's ideas at all as not being valid. I mean, I think they're not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect system, and clearly they're not designed for gi competition. It's a no-gi technique. But also, I think it's important to remember the top game component of Bravo's system, which gets less attention. But, we had Chan Sung Jung bust out the twister, which in wrestling is called a crucifix. It's another neck crank, and he used it successfully in the UFC. So I think...
which he literally learned off a YouTube video.
Yep, an Eddie Bravo YouTube video.
Exactly.
And
our grappling team, I'm not going to call them grappling snobs like the boss. I would not share their likes and dislikes and opinion, but I would absolutely defer to their technical knowledge. I mean,
sure.
Some of the most knowledgeable and articulate guys I've ever encountered. So that I guess I'm going to throw that disclaimer out there. That that being said, I think it's insane to completely denounce what Eddie's done. Just like you said, I mean, if you look at Hazlett versus Bocek, that's almost like saying, a wrestler beat a judo guy. Wrestler's better than judo. I mean, the theme of our whole thing is it's people, it's circumstances, and that kind of thing. And Bocek's a stud too.
Yeah, I think of it as like, in football, you'll see somebody with a defense or offensive scheme. I'm thinking of the old Houston Oilers run and shoot offense, or the old Chicago Bears 46 defense. You have these innovative schemes come along that can be very effective, but any scheme is going to have weaknesses and vulnerability. It's just like chess. When you make a move, when you put a pawn out there, you're not making other moves, and you're creating vulnerabilities anytime, even as you're gaining advantages. And so, Bravo's system isn't perfect, but ask Leonard Garcia how well the twister works. I mean, Chan Sung Jung busted that out. He never saw it coming. It was, and it's available from very common positions. And one thing I also like about Bravo's style is that he has thought it through in a very systematic way. And if you read his books, he gives you decision trees, and here's a route from this position to this position to this position. Here's 5 things you can do from mission control. Here's how to get from mission control to crackhead control, and on and on. Yeah. And you can argue about his nomenclature and everything else, and his marijuana habits and blah, 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 and his heavy metal music, whatever. He thinks in a systematic way, and he's documented his system in a very easy to digest way. And it's made a big impact on the sport. Whether or not some of his ideas have vulnerabilities that can be exploited, well, sure,
everything
does.
Exactly.
And some things are more fundamentally sound than others. But to me, it's the give and take. And Muay Thai, with striking might be more technically sound in a lot of ways than a Taekwondo or Shotokan approach. Still, when you see a guy like Machida busting it out with the Shotokan, it's fun as hell to see. Yeah. And that's what I like seeing. And one last thing before we wrap up, I want to talk about the calf slicer.
God damn, can I talk before you go on here?
Sure,
Sorry.
yeah.
I'm just fucking with you. But real quick on Eddie's system, from an overall big picture, to me, what is, I guess without refute, it has to have some worth to it, is that everyone, you open with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you get punched in the face, you go down a belt color each time. Eddie's system is totally designed on no gi, so it's clinching and squeezing rather than yanking and pulling on the gi. Mm-hmm. So that in itself, that philosophy as a foundation makes a ton of sense, because as well as his packaging, because first of all, I don't give a shit about that. The Gracie's stuff was not proprietary. That's what the world, I was going to say America, the world does. Once an idea comes out, it's cool. People make it their own. They put it in a package. They add their own terminology to it. So I ain't mad at Eddie for all that. I actually respect that he has such a sensible and user-friendly formula. You can kind of learn transitions from reading his chains that he does. So he's a huge, big brain, and I don't care that he's weird either. I like the dude, huge, takes a lot of creativity and a lot of brain power to come up with what he did. Doesn't mean it's extraordinary. No one else could have done it, but if other people, anyone can do that, they're welcome to. So
yeah.
Have at it. I have no ill will against Eddie, and I have a ton of respect for his style. Can you think of the only other grappling systems that I can think of? I know Eric Paulson has one, and I think Matt Hume has one as well, but I don't, you know what I mean? I mean, we need a no-gi system. We can't say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because that's all done with a gi. Yeah. So it has to be specifically no-gi, and those techniques are, not as, I don't want to say obvious, but I think because MMA has become what it is, there's certain things we understand. We talk about them all the time. The history of bits and pieces as they've come to be now. But as far as I know, there's not a lot of people that have a full-blown system for MMA grappling that's effective and logical and has as many different options and a lot of personality like Eddie's does. So the concept of what he's doing, I think, is beautiful. I think we need to see more of it.
Yeah, as far as documented systems, the only athlete that we haven't brought up already with a system that's as well documented, as well thought out for grappling as Bravo's is Matt Lindland's book on wrestling. It's called Dirty Boxing for Wrestling. It's a Victory Belt book. It's out of print, and it's not really about dirty boxing. It's about wrestling for MMA, and it outlines things in a beautifully systematic way with decision trees. Here's the 5 control positions. Here's how you segue from each one of these to any of the others. So if you've got underhooks, double underhooks on a body lock, how do you get to over under? Or you want to get somebody in a headlock, how do you get that? And so Lindland's system, I highly recommend anybody that wants to see a systematic approach to wrestling MMA, check out Lindland's book. But other than him, and Paulson hasn't really put a book out. Matt Hume hasn't put a book out. And so, they've got some video packages, but they haven't been as aggressive about disseminating their ideas as Bravo has. I actually want to do 2 last side jaunts before we wrap this up, because we don't do these very often. The last thing is I want to talk about the maybe irrelevance of competitive jiu-jitsu in an MMA scene. Once upon a time, when somebody who was a world champion in jiu-jitsu came into MMA, they had a massive impact right away.
Even a black belt in the old days. If the guy was a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the fight was over when it hit the ground.
Pretty much. And now, you've got guys like Demian Maia or Roger Gracie who were at the very top level of jiu-jitsu, and they've done very well in MMA. Both of those guys, Maia more so than Roger, have made big impacts in MMA and have pretty successful careers. At the same time, they're not at the championship level. And you've seen other guys like Marcelo Garcia, who had a one-and-done MMA career where he got in there, lost a fight, didn't like it, quit. And nothing against Marcelo. He's a great competitor, great athlete, incredible grappler, but his style didn't apply to MMA that well, or it wasn't, what he wanted. And I think you're seeing the two sports kind of diverge, and it's no longer just a direct pipeline. Anything you want to add on that particular topic?
Well, the reason Marcelo didn't like it is he's a BJJ player fighting MMA. He's not an MMA fighter. So that just reinforces your point. In the old days, a guy who had even won a couple local tournaments could come in, and hold his own. And nowadays you have someone with, Marcelo's credentials that it's a tribute, I guess, to the evolution of MMA. Really, you can't without the gi. And that's another thing we should talk about some other time. But that's why wrestling does so good, because I never got to mention with the influx of judo-based fighters, that's another gi thing. You have to totally adjust to no grips, nothing to grab, making no gi style, where both the Greco and, folk style, freestyle wrestlers that are coming over, it's, they're used to singlets and bare skin. So it's, of course you have to adapt to everything, but that has the least amount of changes you have to make and the most effectiveness right out of the box.
Absolutely. And while we're on this topic, I got to give a shout out to Caro Parisian, who really did incredible work on rethinking judo for a no-gi environment. And if Parisian's Victory Belt book is, I think, invaluable. And I think, Parisian's had some injuries, some drug issues, and his career fell off, way tragically early. The guy should be in the prime of his career right now, and he's basically an afterthought at this point. But people write off the style because Caro's personal problems got between him and a championship. I think that's a huge mistake. I think there's a lot of wisdom in Caro Parisian's methods and techniques, and I think that you'll see more guys study those techniques and just start throwing fools around in the octagon again. I think there's a lot of wisdom out there.
Best judoka in MMA. I mean, there's never been anyone better, more successful, specifically with judo. And it's not like he was a judo guy who came in and hit a couple takedowns. I mean, that dude pulled off sweet adapted judo techniques at the highest level of MMA. Rousey and Hahn are in the mix and they're coming up, but I don't think there's any question. Who was it? Yoshida over in Pride maybe was a mention before, but
I mean, he had a successful MMA career, but in his fights he hardly used any judo.
There's no better judoka in MMA than Caro Parisian at this point. Some people were kind of like, ooh, that's a bold statement, and it's not. There's no one else that holds a candle to him. Caro's a legend as far as judo and MMA.
Yeah, I think John Jones is the only other person who's implemented as many flashy throws, and he didn't even learn him from judo. Mostly learned him in wrestling, although he watched a lot of judo on YouTube. By his own admission. So, I look forward to seeing people pick up those torches. But before we go, the one last thing I want to talk about is the calf slicer. We've seen Charles Oliveira on the second Fox show tapped Eric Wisely with a calf slicer. I don't think anybody saw that coming. That was the first ever calf slicer submission in UFC history. The closest anybody had come was Rafael Dos Anjos. Almost tapped Tyson Griffin with the calf slicer way back in Ultimate Fight Night 18, I think it was.
But someone else didn't Menjivar tap out Lozon with a calf cruncher?
You're correct. That was the second.
Somewhere Tim Burke is doing cartwheels right now.
Yeah.
TKO, I think, way back in the day.
Yeah, but that wasn't a UFC fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a regional, and there have been a few calf slicers in MMA before that, but the Oliveira calf slicer was the first one in the UFC, and I think the slicers, it's a pain move. It's not blood choke or something or a joint break, so it's something that people can survive. Like Griffin, I think just totally toughed out the submission attempt from Dos Anjos, and for the entire next round was walking around like he had a spaghetti noodle for a leg. And so anyway, that's another technique I'm hoping guys are studying up on and adding to their arsenals to be able to throw out there in those odd moments if they seize the opportunity, because that's what I like in MMA is innovation and fun and novelty and excitement and interesting things. If MMA was all about the high percentage positions and the high percentage moves, it would be just extremely boring to me. I like to see guys try the high risk, high reward moves every now and again. Anything else you got to say to wrap this up on Grappling Evolution? What do you anything new?
No. Sometime down the road we should get a specialist coming on. I think most people realize, but for anyone who doesn't, we like to get into technical things, but we like to, know a little bit about everything. We're not, super specialists in any one area. And I would like to get one of those specialists in to maybe talk with us and let us pick their brain a little bit. I wanted to get Thapper or KJ or one of the grappling guys on here today because the entire tone of this conversation would have been, drastically different. Those guys have a level of technique that I don't even dare poke with a 20-foot stick. So sometime in one of these, we should bring in a special guest and really crunch into some of the technical
Absolutely.
aspects.
Luke Thomas and I did a conversation with Dave Camarillo one time that was really fun, and so let's be on the lookout for something like that.
Actually, I could get Cremato or Marcelo Brigadero to come on one time, and that'll be a good something for the future.
Let's do it. All right, everybody. I guess we're going to wrap it up now. This is another MMA Tête-Á-Tête with Dallas Winston and Kid Nate of BloodyElbow.com. If you like this sort of thing, be sure and subscribe to MMA Nation on YouTube, and you'll get all our videos as soon as they're uploaded. You could even be among the lucky few that watch these things live as we shoot them.
That's my favorite part of your closing. You could be one of the lucky ones to watch us live.
Yeah, because, who knows, we could have a Tourette syndrome outburst, and you could see something that we pull off the internet as soon as it's uploaded. But anyway,
way to lure them in. That's going to lure them in right there. You can see, you
got to tease
a Tourette's outburst.
It's all about the anticipation, Dallas. You'd have no idea. This guy is crazy. You just don't know what he might do. Marketing. That's right. Well, all right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. We'll be back with the preview of UFC 155 next week, unless the holidays prevent us. So we'll see you next time, guys.